Welcome to the BrightWord Books podcast. BrightWord is a leading platform for diverse storytelling, where voices from all backgrounds can share their unique narratives and connect with readers from around the world. Follow our regular podcast updates, where we strive to foster a literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature.
Welcome to today's podcast episode. We're delighted to have Barry, the author of We're Overdosed, with us today. In his book, Barry explores the history of opium from its origins and the birth of morphine to the global rise of synthetic opioids and the pharmaceutical industry. As a scientist, Barry offers insights on how federal legislation could help control prescription opioids and discusses the tragic epidemic of opioid overdoses. In addition, he looks forward to the future, offering hope through new treatments for addiction and highlighting how the US can lead efforts to combat the global trade in illicit drugs. Barry, thank you so much for joining us today. To get started, could you perhaps share a little bit about yourself and what actually motivated you to explore this quite complex issue in We're Overdosed?
Good afternoon by my time. Good evening by your time. And it is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Why did I write this book? I tell the story, and it is my first chapter, that many years ago I was working in Europe, so I was traveling frequently, and I came into home on a Friday night, and that weekend I had signed myself up to teach a class called The Pharmacology of Drugs of Abuse to a group of recovering addicts studying to become licensed drug counselors. And during lunch, they invited themselves to join me, and they sat around my table and they said, "Can we ask you a question?" I said, "Of course. Why do you teach us? Are you an addict?" I said, "No, not at all. It's payback for me. Society's been very good to me. I like to teach, and I share my knowledge with people. Why do you ask?" Because only addicts are interested in us. And I thought that was such a tragic statement.
Definitely.
It stayed with me 20 years, and it became the first chapter in a book that I started as a history of opium, because I'm a history nut. I call myself a brass plaque junkie. I read every brass plaque, regardless of language.
Wonderful.
And,
Interesting. You know, I think some people might think that maybe you did have a history, right? When writing this book, and where does that, want and drive come from writing the book?
well, the drive to write, I told my daughter, who's a physician, I told her, "I'm really enjoying writing." And she said, "Dad, you've always enjoyed writing." Well, I haven't lived with her since she was 15, and it occurred to me that I've been writing 35 years.
Yeah.
I have no track record in that area. I've sold some essays. I've sold a piece I wrote based on my memoir. And I tell another story. Many years ago, I was in Dresden, Germany, visiting a pharmaceutical company because I was dispatched there by my American employer to talk to them about licensing a drug from them. And I was late for my meeting, and it was Germany. One is not late in Germany. And I used to work in Germany. It's my favorite place to work. And I saw a brass plaque on the wall, so I stopped to read it. I say, I'm a brass plaque junkie.
Mm-hmm.
And it said aspirin was invented here. Well, some years later, when I was thinking about writing about morphine, I remembered that brass plaque, and I looked up the history of aspirin, and I found out that morphine was invented by the same chemist who invented aspirin.
Interesting.
And how did he invent aspirin? He took salicylic acid and he added acetic acid to it. And we know acetic acid as vinegar.
Hmm.
And he was trying to make aniline. And instead, he made aspirin. 3 weeks later, he added acetic acid to, to morphine and made N-acetylmorphine. And that he took some, said he felt heroisch auf Deutsch in German,
Mhm.
and he named it heroin.
Crazy.
And that's how I became interested in history, because the history of drugs fascinates me.
It's interesting. And in We're Overdosed, it really dives into the long history of opium and its impact on the world. What really first sparked your interest in tracing the origins of opium and morphine in relation to today's opioid crisis, let's call it?
Well, I have a PhD in pharmacology. What do pharmacologists know? They write about drugs. So I was writing about drugs. And as I say, I started writing about the history of morphine and learned of the history of heroin by the same chemist who invented aspirin. And it just triggered my interest. And I said, well, you know what? Maybe I'll try to write a book. And at the time, I was going through some personal strife, shall we call it. My marriage was breaking up, and I was at large, shall we say. And I started writing about the history of aspirin, or the history of opium, and found myself relocating myself and reestablishing myself and trying to make a living at the same time, because I was, as I say, fired for a variety of reasons. I'm sorry, divorced for a variety of reasons. One of was I did not have a job at the time. And I continued writing. And 4 years later, I submitted a book to my agent. And the book was published about a year and a half ago. It did not do well in the US, but I'm very pleased to say that it's selling in the UK
Incredible.
for unknown reason.
Amazing. And you also discuss how the global pharmaceutical industry was born from the synthesis of opioids. How did the development of morphine and synthetic opioids shape the trajectory of this opioid epidemic that we have?
Well, people are texting me. How did the opiates shape the book, or shape the history of the pharmaceutical industry? When the company that invented aspirin called themselves Arzneimittelwerk Dresden, drug industry of Dresden, they licensed the technology to a company, to a pharmacy we knew as Merck. Merck and Merck came to America with the patent for aspirin and invented an American subsidiary, which is not related to the Merck in Germany. And that's how the industry was born. It was born with aspirin.
Crazy. I don't know if many people knew about that. And from your perspective as a scientist, what role do you think the federal legislation could play in gaining control over these prescription opioids, and how can it help perhaps curb this overdose crisis that we see still current today?
Still current. Although 2023 was the only year in the last decade that deaths due to opiate overdose decreased ever so slightly in the U.S. How can federal legislation help? In the book, I had an idea. I said, right now, all the prescriptions in the U.S., and I focused on the U.S. I am an American.
Mhm.
Where else would I focus?
Mhm.
Uh, all the prescriptions are state regulated. So we have 50 different laws governing state prescriptions of drugs. And I said, wait a minute, that's essentially not really controlling the drug industry. That's
Mhm.
essentially a free for all. And I said, what if opiates and other addictive drugs were dispensed on a federal level, not state by state, but per the federal government only? That would allow the government to track prescriptions and
Mhm.
not look at the states to track them. And secondly, it would look at the government and say, wait a minute, using current software or AI, if you will,
Mhm.
we can track the prescriptions and we can block people from taking too many prescriptions of the same drug by crossing the state line and going to another pharmacy,
Yeah.
called doctor shopping. And that was the idea. I said, let's redesign the US cabinet with a drug czar who's responsible for research, for chasing drug dealers, for intersecting illegal imports, and have all of those report to one person. And where did I come up with the idea? I used to manage drug development with a team
Mhm.
approach, and I had different members of the team from all over the world, and we all met by video conference. And I said, wait a minute, it worked well. We solved problems.
Yeah.
Why can't the federal government do that?
Can you see them adapting to that, or can you see that
No,
as
no
some?
one's called me yet to consult on the issue.
Well, hopefully they see this recording.
Well, I hope so. We are visual society now. No, 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 no. No telephone.
Yeah, and you also talk about the evolution of opioids from a medical breakthrough to a source of addiction. So, how do you think this transformation occurred, and what role did the pharmaceutical industry play in it?
Well, in the 18th century in the US, opiates were not scheduled drugs
Hmm.
or scheduled drugs, if you will.
Hmm.
And they were available simply by a physician's prescription. And at the time, prescriptions were handwritten, they
Yeah.
weren't computerized. Well, people began to realize that the concept of addiction was a side effect of opiate dosage.
Yeah.
And gradually, the laws changed. The drugs became scheduled. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, our Drug Enforcement Administration, began scheduling drugs 1 through 4, and Schedule 1 drugs have no medical use. So heroin is a Schedule 1 drug, and for
Mm.
the longest time, so was marijuana. And the laws caught up with people's usage, and the DEA scheduling caught up with people's usage, and realized that these drugs, as I say, they have hooks. Don't get caught.
Hmm.
These drugs caused addiction.
Yeah.
So the laws tightened up on their supply. But as I say, they tightened up on a state by state basis because of the curious way we regulate prescriptions.
Do you feel that the pharmaceutical industry has some onus of responsibility here?
Oh, of course.
Hmm.
I think the industry is guilty of what I call Me Too management.
Hmm.
And the example perhaps is the company in Pennsylvania that is charged with selling OxyContin and blamed for the drug epidemic we have now. I think they looked at that company and said, wait a minute, they're selling $1 billion a year of OxyContin. We should be in the opiate market. It's a big market. So the rest of the industry followed suit and started marketing an opiate, or what I call a Me Too opiate. And I think that's the blame we can lay at industry's feet, and say that they lost their morality and followed Me Too marketing, but these weren't sports cars. These were drugs that killed people.
Yeah, terrible. So the opioid epidemic is often tied to both prescription, as we spoke about, misuse, and the rise of illegal fentanyl. What differences, if any, do you see in the way prescription opioids and illicit opioids are treated by both the public and policymakers?
Well, I don't know that fentanyl plays a role in the illicit market.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does. It clearly plays a role in the illicit market. 70% of the deaths due to drug overdose in this country are due to fentanyl. It's a scary figure. Where's the fentanyl coming from? Well, most agencies in the U.S. trace it back to China, but China's been very clever about it. They don't export fentanyl; they export the precursors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyone who's ever took chemistry understands that you take a precursor and make a final product from a precursor.
Yeah.
What's the precursor of aspirin? Salicylic acid. It's a natural product. And that, I think, is that's the issue behind the change in society today. But we're playing catch up as a society because there was no planning that went on. It's perhaps impossible to prejudge human behavior,
Mm-hmm.
certainly as a group. And accordingly, as I say, we're playing catch up. We're passing laws to change people's behavior. And that's very difficult.
Yeah, that has already been for such a long period of time. It's hard to go back.
And people's behavior doesn't change easily.
Yeah, yeah. In We're Overdosed, you highlight the importance of new treatments for addiction. Can you tell us about some of the innovative treatments you believe could offer hope in tackling this opioid addiction, even so far through this crisis, let's say?
Well, treating addiction involves preventing the drive to take the drug and preventing the withdrawal from the drug. And the drugs we have and have used for years, Narcan, naloxone, and buprenorphine, are those drugs. Narcan is useful for saving lives. If an unconscious patient who's overdosed on an opiate presents, the first thing they do is spray Narcan in the patient's nose. And that generally saves the patient's life. What is it about opiates that's killing people? It suppresses respiration. They suffocate. And it's not a fun thing to watch. Narcan is good for blocking withdrawal or blocking the overdose. Buprenorphine, by contrast, is useful for blocking the withdrawal symptoms.
Okay.
So what we do is we tell drug users, you have to go into drug rehabilitation, drug rehab. And in rehab, if they're not unconscious, they're given buprenorphine as a drug to keep them from wanting to dose, and that allows them to take the behavioral changes that are prescribed.
And do you feel it's something that can be rolled out effectively, or is this just for people who are willing or are aware of it?
Well, it's been shown that people who want to get clean are more likely to be successful getting clean
Makes
than
sense.
addicts who are forced to get clean.
Yeah.
And that speaks to human behavior and human drive. So I think that answers your question. Does anything change? My feeling is that in order for us to change as a society, we should stop using opiates.
Yeah.
But we're waiting for a new drug. And I
Okay.
was pleased to read in the paper about a week ago that clinical trials are going on with a new drug that blocks pain not by binding to opiate receptors, which we have in our brains, but through a different pathway. And therefore, they're not addicting. Now,
Okay.
whether they're good for a broken bone or an automobile accident or a fall, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was pleased to see the industry is looking to achieve success with a new drug mechanism.
Yeah. And we spoke a little bit about, being critical of the way opioids were marketed to doctors and patients, let's say, in the past. What do you think we can learn from this history to avoid similar mistakes with new medications in the future?
What can we learn? I think as a society, we can learn that drugs that produce addiction should not be given chronically.
Yeah.
But that begs the question then, what do we give cancer patients?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so important to have new drugs that work by a different mechanism, because there are groups of people who require drugs like opiates. But what do we learn otherwise? Well, we've learned how to regulate prescriptions in some states. For example, in my own state, New Jersey, it's against the law for me to take my prescription to New York State, which is only 8 miles away, and go to a drugstore in New York State and fill that prescription if it's written for an opiate. Secondly, what does it mean to have a prescription? Well, most prescriptions today are written electronically, and they're a contract between the physician's office and the local pharmacy, not between the doctor and the patient. So it's becoming more difficult to forge a prescription, but we're not there yet. And I think managing opiate, I mentioned centrally, will go very far to leveling the law throughout the 50 states of the United States.
Yeah. Interesting. And, it's become a global crisis, not just something in the US, obviously. How do you see international cooperation playing a role in, addressing the supply of illicit drugs? And what steps should global leaders perhaps take to curb the spread? So on a global level.
You're asking me to speculate in areas that I'm not expert.
You can pass
Well,
if you want.
what,
You have one
what
pass.
can we do internationally? Well, I don't want to become political because politics has taken over the news here in the U.S.
All over.
in the last 2 weeks. Uh, I think I do think we need to seal the border. But what does that mean? Seal the border.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not against hourly workers crossing the border to seek employment in the U.S. My grandparents crossed the border to seek employment in the U.S. I can't prevent other people from looking for the opportunity. But how do we keep the drugs from crossing the border from Mexico?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we convinced the Mexicans, for example, to go after the Sinaloa cartel. And those are the people who are making the drug out of the precursors they buy from China
Mm-hmm.
and smuggling it into the US. How do they smuggle it into the US? They bury it in a trailer filled with Mexican blue corn. How do you find a package this big on a trailer with 58 tons of corn on it?
A lot of corn.
Well, I say that because that's one of our imports from Mexico. But how do we interdict the shipment? I said, let's harness technology. If I can take my cell phone and open my garage door with my cell phone, why can't my cell phone sniff out opium on a truckload of corn?
Yeah.
It's plausible. All we have to do is give Apple or somebody a contract and say, go invent this for us. We need a machine that will sniff out opium in something else that smells.
Yeah.
And it's been suggested to me that can't a dog do that? And I really don't think a dog can sniff fentanyl on a
Mm-hmm.
truckload of corn because the dog's sense of smell will be overwhelmed by the corn,
Yeah.
if it has any smell at all. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's one idea. Another idea is we go back further and say to the Chinese, listen, get control of your precursor mills and stop shipping your precursors to the cartel in Mexico. Well, what do we learn about the creation of these mills, these precursors? The Chinese industry has recruited chemistry majors from universities to become their chemists to
Wow.
synthesize these precursors and then ship the precursors to Mexico. So they're clever. They're 2 years ahead of everybody else's thinking.
Yeah.
And I really think the governments themselves should be the ones to clamp down. I don't think the U.S. can go after the Sinaloa cartel, and I think the U.S. can ask, but not, and perhaps demand of China to prevent these precursors from reaching Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the way to go about it is by leveling tariffs on imported products,
Yeah.
because that just makes them more expensive. It doesn't make them unavailable.
Stop them. Yeah, exactly. What impact do you think the opioid epidemic has had on the public health systems? And how can healthcare providers adapt to better treat those suffering from opioid addiction? I know that's quite a long question.
Well, I think we need to restructure opium treatment. And I think, for example, every hospital should have a rehab.
Yeah.
I think the industry should make the drugs to treat opium overdose and opium withdrawal, I think they should be free to these clinics. I don't think anybody should have to pay $35 to carry Narcan in a first aid kit.
Yeah.
Number one, I think that would multiply the number of drug rehabs. I think, secondly, television is a wonderful medium for teaching us a way to behave. What do I mean by that? Well, when COVID was killing 70,000 people a year 3 or 4 years ago, it was on television every night.
Yeah.
Why was it on television every night? We all wore masks. We all
Yeah.
Zoomed for work. I watched my son do his homework by Zoom. He hated it. And television taught us that. And television taught us to be afraid of COVID.
Yeah.
But now that opiate overdose is killing over 100,000 Americans a year, it's not on television.
Yeah.
So I drew the conclusion. I said, well, COVID victims must have been more important than drug overdose victims.
Yeah. It's crazy.
And that's why it's flippant. I think
Yeah.
I think television could go very, very far to advertise drug rehab,
Yeah.
to discuss a number to call to find a rehab.
More awareness.
I think the public needs awareness, and I like to think my book provides the knowledge they need.
Yeah, wonderful, Barry. I'm sure it does. And lastly, as we look towards the future, what is your overall message for readers who want to make a difference in the fight against opioid addiction? And how can individuals, communities, and governments take action? The people listening, perhaps we can have a message for them.
Wow. That's a
big one.
That's a big one. Well, I think I mentioned teaching people through the television medium. Now, that said, we're watching less and less television, and most of us are streaming, watching YouTube and Hulu TV and Netflix. So what else can they do? Well, I would like to see young people taught about opiates in high school. I think a health class in high school can do a few months on opiate addiction and the pharmacology of opiate addiction. I mean, I open my lectures by saying, listen, if I buy a bag of pretzels, I can't stop eating until I finish the pretzels. Am I addicted to pretzels? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
Because by definition, we can't be addicted to food. There's no withdrawal. There's no side effect. The only side effect is I'm thirsty. But we have to teach people in high school and say, listen, you guys are intelligent. You're about to enter the world. This is what you should know about it.
Yeah.
We say that they're candidates for sex education. I think they're candidates for health education. And the health I'm talking about is the danger that's out there.
Yeah. Give them the tools and the knowledge and the awareness before they get to a place maybe that they shouldn't be.
I think they should all learn to make a phone call.
Yeah.
Call the ambulance, call the police, call someone. If they find someone unconscious, call an ambulance and say the patient needs Narcan.
Yeah.
To save his life.
Wonderful, Barry. It's been very interesting. And thank you so much. Do you have any last words before we wrap up this episode?
Other than a commercial for my book, We're Overdosed?
Exactly.
Why We're Overdosed? Read it and take lessons from it.
Wonderful. So thank you for listening to the BrightWord Books podcast, Overdose, the Global Battle Against Opioid Addiction, Episode 2. If you'd like to dig deeper into the history, science, and potential solutions behind opioid crisis, be sure to grab a copy of We're Overdosed by Barry Gold, available now on Amazon. This thought-provoking book provides crucial insights into the origins of opioid addiction, the need for change in federal policies, and the hope for new treatments. Don't forget to subscribe for more episodes as we continue exploring this critical issue. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the BrightWord Books podcast, home of the literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss future episodes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.